If the old man wakes up, we are finished. So we need to make sure that the doctors keep him sedated until the paperwork is signed.
He was 78 years old and worth $42 billion, and he had absolutely no one left to trust. For 12 years, the same man had cooked his eggs every morning at exactly 6:15. For 12 years, his 3 children had called him exactly once a month usually when they needed something. Harold Winthrop, the billionaire who built an empire from nothing, sat alone in his 65-room mansion on a Tuesday afternoon in October and realized that his family had already started dividing his fortune while he was still breathing. His oldest son, Derek, had quietly transferred $2.7 million into a shell company in the Cayman Islands. His daughter, Victoria, had put his Greenwich estate up for sale behind his back. His youngest son, Bradley, had been photographed in Ibiza on a yacht that Harold did not own. The chef, whose name was Marco, had made him an omelet that morning the same way he had done it for 4,380 mornings in a row without missing a single day. And in that moment, Harold Winthrop made a decision that would shock the world. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The plan was simple, and it was cruel, and Harold Winthrop did not care anymore. He would disappear not to an island and not to another country, but into a hospital bed. He would fake a coma, a complete neurological collapse that would leave him unresponsive and unable to speak, and for 30 days, he would lie there listening to the people who claimed to love him. His personal physician, Dr. Raymond Carter, was paid $7 million to keep the secret and to administer the drugs that would slow Harold's heart rate and lower his brain activity to levels that fooled every monitor in the room. On the morning of October 15th, Harold Winthrop was found unconscious in his study by Marco, who had arrived to make breakfast, and found the billionaire slumped over his desk with a half-empty glass of whiskey on the floor. The ambulance arrived 17 minutes later, and by noon, the entire financial world knew that the man who had built a $42 billion logistics empire was in a coma and might never wake up. His children flew in from 3 different countries within 24 hours, and they did not come to sit by his bedside. They came to find the will. The hospital room was dark and quiet, and Harold could hear everything. The drugs made him feel like he was underwater, but his mind was razor sharp, and he listened as his family walked in and out of that room like they were visiting a museum exhibit rather than their dying father. Derek, the oldest, arrived first, and he did not touch his father's hand, and he did not speak to him. He opened the drawer next to the hospital bed and searched for a key to the safe deposit box at Chase Manhattan. When he did not find it, he left without saying goodbye. Victoria came next, and she sat in the chair for exactly 11 minutes, and she spent 10 of those minutes on her phone negotiating the sale of the Greenwich property. Bradley did not come at all. He sent his lawyer. Marco came every single morning at 5 a.m. before the sun rose, and he did not speak, and he did not search for anything. He sat in the plastic chair next to the bed, and he read Harold the baseball scores from the newspaper, and he wiped the billionaire's forehead with a damp cloth even though Harold could not feel it, or at least that is what everyone believed. Marco brought the omelet ingredients every day: eggs and chives, and a little bit of cream, and he made the omelet in the hospital's family kitchen, and when it was done he threw it in the trash and made it again because he knew Harold would want it fresh if he ever woke up. The children grew impatient by the end of the first week. Derek wanted to move Harold to a cheaper facility because the private room at Mount Sinai was costing $47,000 a week, and he was planning to contest the will on the grounds of diminished capacity, but he needed the money to pay the lawyers. Victoria wanted to sell the art collection, the Monets, and the Picassos that hung in the Manhattan penthouse, and she had already hired an auction house to appraise them. Bradley was the worst. Bradley flew back to Ibiza, and he sent a text message to his siblings that said, and I am quoting this directly from the court records later made public, and I want you to listen very carefully to these words, because they are the exact words that Harold Winthrop heard while he lay in that hospital bed pretending to be dead to the world. Bradley wrote, and I quote, "If the old man croaks before the lawyers finish the paperwork, we split everything 3 ways without the trust taking its cut, so let's hope the chef keeps feeding him scrambled eggs, because that heart needs to stop sooner rather than later." Harold heard those words. He heard them because Victoria read the text message out loud to Derek while standing at the foot of his hospital bed, and she laughed and Derek laughed, and Harold Winthrop, the man who had given them everything, every private school, every luxury car, every trust fund payment, felt something inside him turn to stone. Marco did not know about the plan, and that was the point. Harold had chosen him specifically because Marco had no idea that he was being tested. The chef was 58 years old, and he had been divorced for 15 years, and his only son lived in Oregon and barely spoke to him. He had no money and no prospects, and no reason to be loyal to a billionaire who paid him $120,000 a year, which was a lot of money for a chef, but nothing compared to what the children were stealing. And yet, Marco showed up every single day. He did not know about the cameras hidden in the smoke detectors, and he did not know about the microphone hidden in the bed rails, and he certainly did not know that Harold could hear every word he said. On day 12, Marco did something that made Harold want to end the experiment right then and there. He leaned over the hospital bed, and he whispered into Harold's ear, and he said, "Boss, I do not know if you can hear me, but I want you to know that your children are trying to take everything, and I will not let them. I have been recording their conversations. I have been saving the texts they send to each other. When you wake up, I will give you everything, and if you do not wake up, I will give it all to the police." Harold Winthrop, who had not cried since he was 12 years old, felt tears run down his cheeks, and Marco wiped them away with the same damp cloth he used every morning, and he thought it was just a reflex of the dying brain. On day 18, the children made their move. They hired a lawyer named Arthur Klein who specialized in conservatorship cases, and they filed paperwork to have Harold declared mentally incompetent, which would give Derek control over the entire $42 billion estate. The hearing was scheduled for day 25, and Harold knew he had to wake up before then, but he also knew that if he woke up too early, he would never know the full truth. He wanted to hear everything. He wanted to know exactly who had betrayed him, and exactly how much they had stolen, and exactly what they had said about him while he lay helpless in that bed. So he waited and he listened, and what he heard in those final 7 days would break any father's heart, but Harold Winthrop was no longer a father. He was a judge, and he was about to deliver a verdict that would make headlines around the world. On day 20, Victoria came to the hospital alone, and she sat in the chair for 3 hours. She did not say a word to Harold's body, but she made phone calls. She called a real estate agent in Greenwich, and she told the agent to lower the price on the mansion by $4 million because she needed to sell it before the conservatorship hearing. She called a gallery owner in Manhattan, and she asked how quickly the Monets could be shipped to Geneva. She called Derek, and she said, and I am quoting the recording that Harold later played in open court, "If the old man wakes up, we are finished, so we need to make sure that the doctors keep him sedated until the paperwork is signed." Harold heard every word, and he felt nothing for her anymore. The love he had felt when he held her as a baby, the pride he had felt when she graduated from Columbia, the forgiveness he had shown when she crashed his vintage Ferrari at age 19, all of it evaporated in that moment, and what remained was a cold and absolute certainty that Victoria was no longer his daughter. She was a stranger who had stolen his bloodline. On day 22, Derek brought his own lawyer to the hospital. The lawyer, whose name was Mitchell Reeves, was a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, and he carried a leather satchel full of documents. Derek stood at the foot of Harold's bed, and he pointed at his father's face, and he said to Mitchell, "Look at him. He is a vegetable. He cannot speak, and he cannot sign anything, and he certainly cannot fight us. The judge will give me control by Friday, and then we drain the accounts before the end of the month." Mitchell Reeves looked at Harold's body, and he nodded, and he said, "I will need a second medical opinion to confirm brain death, but I know a doctor in New Jersey who will say whatever we pay him to say." Derek smiled, and he said, "Money is not a problem. It is his money anyway, and he is not using it anymore." Harold listened to this conversation, and he felt a rage building inside him that he had not felt since he was a young man fighting for contracts in the shipping yards of Newark. But he did not move, and he did not open his eyes because he knew that the rage was useful, and that the rage would fuel him when the time came to destroy everything his children had tried to steal. On day 23, Marco arrived at 4:30 in the morning, which was 30 minutes earlier than usual, and he looked tired. His eyes were red, and his hands were shaking, and he sat down in the plastic chair, and he did not read the baseball scores. He just sat there in the dark, and after a long time he spoke. He said, "Boss, I do not know if you can hear me, but I am scared. I am scared for you, and I am scared for me, and I am scared that they are going to win. I have been recording everything like I told you, but I do not know if it will be enough. I am just a cook, and they are billionaires, and billionaires always win." Harold wanted to reach out and grab Marco's hand and tell him that the billionaires did not always win, and that this time the cook would win, and the billionaires would lose everything. But he could not move, and he could not speak, and so he lay there in the dark listening to the only man who loved him cry silently in a plastic chair at 4:30 in the morning. On day 24, Victoria came back to the hospital, and this time she brought a priest. The priest was a tall man with a gray beard, and he stood next to Harold's bed, and he began to read last rites from a small leather book. Victoria stood behind the priest, and she was not crying and she was not praying. She was watching the door because she was waiting for someone. 5 minutes later, Derek walked in with Mitchell Reeves, and the second doctor from New Jersey, whose name was Dr. Harold Pender, a man who had lost his medical license twice and somehow gotten it back both times. Dr. Pender examined Harold for exactly 4 minutes. He shone a light in Harold's eyes, and he listened to his heart, and he looked at the monitors, and he turned to Derek, and he said, "In my professional opinion, this man is brain dead, and there is no reasonable expectation of recovery." Derek smiled, and he turned to the priest, and he said, "Finish the rites, Father, because we have a conservatorship hearing tomorrow, and I need my father to be dead enough for the judge to believe it." The priest looked at Derek, and then he looked at Victoria, and then he looked at Harold's body, and he closed his book, and he said, "I cannot do this. I cannot pretend to give last rites to a man who might still be alive in the eyes of God." Derek grabbed the priest by the arm, and he said, "You will do what I pay you to do, or I will call your bishop, and I will tell him about the money you took from the church charity fund." The priest turned white, and he opened his book, and he finished the last rites with a trembling voice, and Harold Winthrop, who had been raised Catholic, and who had not attended Mass in 40 years, listened to a man read him his own death prayer, while his children stood over him and counted the minutes until they could cash in. On day 25, the conservatorship hearing began at 10 a.m. in a courtroom in downtown Manhattan. Derek and Victoria sat at the defense table with Mitchell Reeves and Dr. Harold Pender. Bradley was not there because he was still in Ibiza, but his lawyer sat at the table with a tablet computer that showed Bradley's face on a video call. The judge was a woman named Patricia Okonkwo, who had been on the bench for 22 years, and she had seen every kind of family fight imaginable. She looked at the paperwork, and she looked at the medical reports, and she looked at Derek, and she said, "Your father is worth $42 billion, and you are asking me to give you control of that money because you say he is brain dead. Where is the independent medical examination from a doctor who does not have a disciplinary record with the state medical board?" Mitchell Reeves stood up and he said, "Your Honor, Dr. Pender is fully qualified, and his examination was thorough, and we have additional documentation from Mount Sinai Hospital confirming that Mr. Winthrop is in a persistent vegetative state." Judge Okonkwo looked at the Mount Sinai report, and she frowned, and she said, "This report is signed by Dr. Raymond Carter, who has been Mr. Winthrop's personal physician for 20 years. Where is Dr. Carter today?" "I do not see him on the witness list." Derek and Victoria exchanged a look, and Mitchell Reeves said, "Dr. Carter was unavailable, Your Honor, but we can produce him at a later date." Judge Okonkwo tapped her pen on the desk, and she said, "I am going to adjourn this hearing until tomorrow at 9 a.m., and I expect Dr. Raymond Carter to be in this courtroom, or I will hold every single one of you in contempt." The hearing ended, and Derek slammed his fist on the table, and Victoria started yelling at Mitchell Reeves, and Bradley screamed through his tablet connection from Ibiza, and Harold Winthrop lay in his hospital bed 3 miles away, listening to every word through a live audio feed that Dr. Raymond Carter had set up on his phone. Dr. Carter was not unavailable. He was sitting in Harold's hospital room with the phone on the bed next to Harold's ear, and he was smiling because he knew what Harold was going to do tomorrow, and he knew that the courtroom was about to become a theater of revenge, unlike anything New York had ever seen. On the morning of day 26, Harold Winthrop woke up. He woke up at 4 a.m., and he sat up in bed, and he looked at Dr. Raymond Carter, and he said, "It is time." Dr. Carter administered the antidote to the drugs that had been slowing Harold's heart, and he helped the billionaire shower and shave and dress in a tailored suit that Marco had brought from the mansion the day before. Marco arrived at 5 a.m., and he found Harold sitting in a chair eating an omelet that Dr. Carter had made, which was not as good as Marco's omelets, but Harold ate it anyway, because he was hungry for the first time in weeks. Marco dropped the bag of groceries he was carrying, and he stared at Harold, and he said, "Boss, you are awake." Harold looked at Marco, and he smiled, and he said, "I was never asleep, Marco. I was listening. And I heard everything you said, and everything they said, and today we are going to court, and you are coming with me." Marco started crying again, and Harold stood up and he put his hand on Marco's shoulder, and he said, "Do not cry, my friend. Today we win." The car arrived at 7 a.m., a black Lincoln Town car, driven by Harold's personal security chief, and they drove from Mount Sinai to the courthouse in silence. Harold looked out the window at the streets of Manhattan, and he thought about the first building he had ever bought in this city, a small warehouse on the west side that cost him $70,000 in 1982, and he thought about how that warehouse had been the beginning of everything, and how today the beginning of everything would become the end of something else. The end of his family. The end of his name. The end of the Winthrop dynasty that he had spent $42 billion and 60 years of his life building. And he felt nothing. No sadness. No regret. No grief. He felt the cold clarity of a man who has been betrayed by everyone he loved and who has found something better than love. He had found loyalty. The courtroom was full at 9 a.m. Reporters had heard that something unusual was happening in Judge Okonkwo's courtroom, and they had come with cameras and notepads and phones. Derek and Victoria sat at the defense table with Mitchell Reeves and Dr. Harold Pender. Bradley's face was on the tablet again, squinting from the Ibiza sun. Judge Okonkwo walked in at 9:15, and she looked at the defense table, and she said, "Where is Dr. Raymond Carter?" Before Mitchell Reeves could answer, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and Harold Winthrop walked in. He walked slowly because he was 78 years old, and he had been in a bed for 26 days, but he walked with his head high and his shoulders back, and his eyes fixed on his children. Derek stood up so fast that his chair fell over backwards. Victoria put her hand over her mouth, and Bradley's face on the tablet went completely white. The reporters started typing, and the cameras started clicking, and Judge Okonkwo banged her gavel and said, "Order in the court. Order." Harold walked to the front of the courtroom, and he stood in front of the judge's bench, and he said, "Your Honor, my name is Harold Winthrop, and I am not brain dead, and I am not in a coma, and I am not a vegetable. I am very much alive, and I am here to tell you that my children have been trying to steal my fortune while I lay in a hospital bed, pretending to be unconscious." The courtroom erupted again, and Judge Okonkwo banged her gavel 5 times before the room fell silent. She looked at Harold and she said, "Mr. Winthrop, are you telling me that you faked a coma?" Harold looked at his children, and he said, "Yes, Your Honor, I faked a coma to test my family, and only my chef stayed loyal, and now I am going to show you exactly what my children did while they thought I could not hear them." What happened next took 4 hours. Harold Winthrop played recordings for the court. He played the recording of Victoria negotiating the sale of the Greenwich mansion. He played the recording of Derek asking Mitchell Reeves about draining the accounts. He played the recording of Bradley's text message about hopping the old man croaked. He played the recording of Victoria telling the priest to finish the last rites. He played the recording of Dr. Harold Pender lying about brain death for money. He played 47 recordings in total, and each one was worse than the last, and each one made Derek and Victoria sink lower in their chairs, and each one made the reporters in the gallery write faster and faster. Judge Okonkwo listened to every single recording without saying a word, and when the last recording ended, she turned to Derek and she said, "You should be ashamed of yourself. All of you should be ashamed of yourselves. I have been a judge for 22 years, and I have never seen children treat their father the way you have treated yours." Derek tried to speak, but Mitchell Reeves grabbed his arm and whispered in his ear, and Derek sat down. Victoria was crying, but her tears were not tears of regret. They were tears of rage because she knew she had lost, and she knew she had lost everything. Bradley disconnected his tablet, and his face disappeared from the screen, and his lawyer packed up his briefcase and walked out of the courtroom without saying a word. Judge Okonkwo dismissed the conservatorship case with prejudice, which meant that Derek and Victoria and Bradley could never file it again. She ordered Derek to return the $2.7 million he had transferred to the Cayman Islands within 30 days or face criminal charges. She referred Dr. Harold Pender to the State Medical Board for investigation, and she told Mitchell Reeves that she would be reporting his conduct to the Bar Association. And then she looked at Harold Winthrop, and she said, "Mr. Winthrop, you have the right to press criminal charges against your children for attempted fraud and elder abuse. Do you want to do that?" Harold looked at Derek and Victoria, and he thought about it for a long moment, and then he said, "No, Your Honor. I do not want to put my children in prison. I want them to live with the knowledge of what they tried to do, and I want the whole world to know what kind of people they really are." Derek stood up and he pointed at his father, and he said, "You are dead to me. Do you hear me? You are dead." Harold looked at his son and he said, "I have been dead to you for years, Derek. The only difference is that now everyone knows it." Derek stormed out of the courtroom and Victoria followed him, and the reporters chased them down the hallway, and Harold Winthrop stood alone in front of the judge's bench, and he did not cry and he did not smile. He just stood there with his hands in his pockets, and after a minute he walked back to where Marco was sitting in the back row of the gallery, and he sat down next to him, and he said, "Let us go home, Marco. I want an omelet." Marco nodded, and he stood up, and the two men walked out of the courtroom together, and the reporters parted to let them pass, and the cameras captured the image that would appear on every news network in America that night. An old billionaire and an old chef walking side by side out of a courthouse where a family had died, and something else had been born. The new will was filed the next morning. Harold Winthrop left 100% of his $42 billion estate to Marco the chef. He left $1 to Derek and $1 to Victoria and $1 to Bradley. The $1 was not an accident. Harold explained it in a statement that he released to the press, and I want to read you that statement because it explains everything about the kind of man Harold Winthrop was and the kind of man he became. Harold wrote, and I quote, "I left my children $1 each because I wanted them to know that I did not forget them. I remembered them exactly as they were and exactly as they became. The dollar is not an inheritance. It is a verdict. It is my final judgment on their character and their loyalty and their love. They wanted my money and they tried to steal it while I lay helpless in a hospital bed. Now they have my money, $1 each. I hope they spend it wisely." The statement went viral within hours, and it was shared millions of times across every social media platform, and people who had never heard of Harold Winthrop before suddenly had opinions about him, and about his children, and about the chef who had inherited $42 billion just for making omelets and reading baseball scores. Marco did not give any interviews for the first week because he did not know what to say. He was a cook, and cooks do not talk about money, and cooks do not talk about fame, and cooks certainly do not talk about inheriting $42 billion from a man who was not their father. But on the 8th day, Marco agreed to speak to a reporter from the New York Times, and the interview ran on the front page above the fold, and in that interview Marco said something that made Harold cry when he read it. Marco said, "I did not want the money. I still do not want the money. I wanted my friend to wake up, and I wanted him to be okay, and I wanted to keep making his omelets because that is what I have done every day for 12 years, and that is what I plan to do every day for the next 12 years. The money is not mine. The money belongs to the man who earned it, and the man who earned it gave it to me because he had nobody else to give it to, and that is the saddest thing I have ever heard in my entire life." The reporter asked Marco what he was going to do with the money, and Marco said he was going to give most of it away because he did not need $42 billion to be happy. He needed a kitchen and a stove and a man who appreciated a good omelet, and that was all he had ever needed and all he would ever need. The children did not go quietly. Derek hired a new lawyer, and he filed a lawsuit challenging the will on the grounds that Harold was mentally incompetent when he signed it. The lawsuit lasted 18 months, and it cost Derek every dollar he had left, and at the end of those 18 months, the judge threw the case out because Harold had been examined by 3 independent psychiatrists who all agreed that he was perfectly sane and perfectly aware of what he was doing. Victoria tried a different approach. She went on television and she gave interviews to every network that would have her, and she told a story about a cruel father who had abandoned his children and a loyal daughter who had only wanted to protect the family legacy. The interviews did not go well because the recordings existed, and every time Victoria said something that contradicted the recordings, the news networks played the recordings right after her interview, and the American people watched a woman lie to their faces while her own voice proved her wrong. Victoria stopped giving interviews after the 3rd one, and she moved to Utah, and she married a man she met at a recovery retreat, and she has not spoken to her father since the day of the hearing. Bradley is still in Ibiza, and he is still spending money he does not have, and he will likely run out before he turns 50, because the $1 his father left him did not even cover the cost of the taxi from the airport to his villa. Bradley tried to sell his story to a tabloid in London, but the tabloid offered him only £5,000 because they said nobody in England cared about a spoiled American billionaire's son, and Bradley took the money because he needed it to pay his electric bill. Marco kept his word about the money. He set up the Marco Family Foundation, which gives scholarships to culinary students and builds housing for retired chefs and provides emergency grants to restaurant workers who lose their jobs or get sick or need help paying for medical care. In the first 3 years, the foundation gave away $400 million, and Marco personally reviewed every single grant application because he wanted to make sure the money was going to people who actually needed it, and not to people who were trying to take advantage of his generosity. Harold helped Marco run the foundation, and the 2 men became closer than Harold had ever been with his own children. They had dinner together every night, and they watched baseball together every weekend, and they traveled together to Italy and France and Japan, where Marco studied local cooking techniques, and Harold sat in the kitchen and watched him work and ate whatever Marco put in front of him without complaint. When people asked Harold if he regretted what he had done to his children, he always gave the same answer. He said, "I did not do anything to my children. They did everything to themselves. I just watched and listened and made a decision based on the evidence. If that makes me cruel, then so be it. But I would rather be cruel and honest than kind and dead, while my children divide my fortune like vultures on a fence." The story of Harold Winthrop and Marco the chef has become a legend in American business culture. It is taught in business schools as a case study in trust and loyalty and the limits of blood relationships. It is cited in legal journals as an example of how elder abuse can happen in wealthy families just as easily as in poor ones. It is discussed in therapy offices across the country as families confront the uncomfortable question of who would actually show up if the money disappeared tomorrow. And it is remembered every single morning at 6:15 in a modest house in Connecticut, where an 81-year-old billionaire sits at a kitchen table and waits for his best friend to bring him an omelet with a little bit of chives and a lot of respect. The moral of this story is not about money, and it is not about revenge, and it is certainly not about billionaires who fake comas to test their families. The moral of this story is about loyalty and about the quiet people in your life who show up every single day without asking for recognition or reward. Harold Winthrop had 3 children who would have sold him for a percentage of his estate, and 1 chef who would have given him his last dollar if Harold needed it. That is the difference between family and family. The people who share your blood do not always share your heart, and the people who share your heart do not always share your blood. Marco was not Harold's son, but he became Harold's son on the day that Harold realized that Derek, Victoria, and Bradley were never really his children at all. They were just strangers who happened to have his last name. And Harold Winthrop, the billionaire who built an empire from nothing, learned in the final chapter of his life that the greatest fortune he ever found was not the $42 billion he accumulated over 6 decades of work. It was the man who made his omelets every morning at 6:15 for 12 years without missing a single day. That is a fortune that money cannot buy, and that is a fortune that will never run out. If you are watching this video right now, and you are thinking about the people in your own life, the people who show up for you when you are sick and when you are broke, And when you have nothing left to offer, I want you to ask yourself one question, and I want you to answer it honestly. Who would sit by your hospital bed if you could not wake up? And who would be at the lawyer's office before your body was even cold? The answer to that question is worth more than $42 billion, and it always has been. Thank you for watching.